Pure Natural Sheep and Certified Chemical Free present Should You Do Genetic Testing for St. Croix Sheep? Hi, I'm John Hurt. Today we're going to talk about genetic testing for St. Croix sheep. Genetic testing really goes along the line of terrain theory, which was first discussed by Antoine Bouchot. Bouchot believed that there was something wrong with the body that allowed diseases to invade it in the first place. And this is the cause of disease was a bad body. Louis Pasteur came out with the germ theory of disease that said that germs are the cause of all diseases. Well, it's really both. It's both the body and the germ. But when you have a weak body, if you can fix that, you won't have germs. Now, one of the reasons I believe we have weak bodies in our livestock and why they get sick is that we've reached the selection limit in our genetics of trying to make a larger animal, and that has impacted the genetics of all of our animals. The selection limit is reached when we have a cessation of progress, even when we have continual selection being applied to a trait such as a larger body size. Even as you continue to select for this trait, you make no further progress past a certain point. For as you continue to select for body size, all the alleles get used up. All the different variations for that trait get fixed or used up, and you can't go any further. And so even if the trait, such as body mass, is under continual selection to increase, then over time, all the alleles or genetic variants at all the loci, which is the positions on the chromosome, these will continue to increase in frequency to make the individuals much larger. But at some point, all the favored alleles at all the different loci will become the only ones remaining at those loci. So all the chromosome data has been used up. This is why you can't raise a sheep the size of a cow if you didn't want to do that. So there's a limit to what you can do to make the body bigger, and they found that with a lot of these different sheep breeds. So as you continue to relentlessly select for larger body size, you find that the alleles that make the larger body size might also cause other complications such as infertility, which then makes the animal unable to have offspring, even leading to the extinction of the animal. So trying to breed a larger sheep really is hurting it. It may be hurting in other ways besides just infertility. It could be hurting in all these other genetic traits we see. So when we do genetic testing, we're looking for defects in the genetic code. We're not looking for a disease in a certain animal, but rather that it now has a genetic defect that allows it to become sick in ways that weren't possible before. Genetic tests look for genetic defects in the animal that opens the animal up to diseases. It doesn't look for diseases. One of the first people to ever do artificial selection of animals to improve the breed was this Robert Bakewell. And I think he did a lot of inbreeding because he didn't know anything about Mendel or anything. He was 80 years before Mendel. He was so early. And so he inbred a lot of his animals to get the results he wanted. Bakewell created several new breeds of sheep, the Lincoln Longwool and the English Leicester. But the controversy surrounding Bakewell is that his relentless inbreeding was actually the cause of the scrapie problem with prionic diseases. Here are two books listed in Wikipedia from that quote from that time period. And it says, as soon as the scrapie problem broke out in Reverend Thomas's Combers district and the surrounding areas, all the aristocrats pointed a finger at Bakewell and his breeding practices. And so they all thought that the scrapie problem came out of Bakewell's work, mostly through inbreeding. So as Bakewell reached his own selection limit, he somehow destroyed the genetic code that allowed scrapie to take off. And somehow the three codons, or three places on the genetic code that allow scrapie to happen, they somehow got damaged in modern sheep. And if you look at this list of all the times that scrapie was found outside of Europe, they've all come from different breeds like the Suffolk or the Hampshire Down that's come from the UK. And it wasn't just Bakewell, it was all the people that followed Bakewell. And here's what they did wrong. They used a single ram, a single superior ram, and they bred him over and over and over again. They line bred him to get these magnificent changes in a short period of time. Line breeding does happen, but never to the level of Bakewell and the others. And it's still happening today. They're still doing it, but they call it line breeding instead of inbreeding. Now, it's important to note that the Mouflon, which is the ancestor of all modern sheep, it's never had scrapie. It's never had a lot of these other genetic problems because it's never been inbred by man. It's never been taken over by man and made to act in an unnatural way. Because according to Fisher's principle, the sex ratio of almost every species on Earth will come out to 1-to-1 between males and females. And when you have an equal number of males and females, you have much less inbreeding. So in nature, you don't have these problems. It's only when man shows up with this single ram. This idea of using a single ram over and over again, that has to be the most damaging thing we've ever done to our domesticated animals. We need to stop. So if there are defects in the genetic code, how do you do a genetic test on your domesticated animals? Allflex sells these little tissue sample units that will pop a little small piece of flesh right through the animal's ear and collect it for you. And they have a gun that you can use that will collect the sample. It's just like putting a tag in an animal's ear. And in fact, cattletags.com even lets you put a tag on the animal at the same time you collect the tissue sample. So you get 2 in 1. So it's pretty easy to get the sample. Now, the best place I found for processing the tissue sample for genetic testing is this Flock 54 out of California. They're really helpful. And for $20, they will do a ton of tests, about 20 or 22 tests, and tell you what kind of genetics you have in your sheep. So let me go through their test and tell you what I know about St. Croix sheep and how it applies to them. So the first one is scrapie, and the test results will tell if it's RR, where there's no way it can have scrapie, QR, where it's just a carrier of a gene, and QQ, where it can become affected by scrapie. And St. Croix have all these, but the difference is there's not been one documented case of St. Croix sheep ever having scrapie. Now, that may be hard to believe, but I credit it to their immune system because this is a virus, and so they've got a very strong immune system, and apparently it's protected them against scrapie. Now, here's ovine progressive pneumonia. It's a lentivirus that's transmitted through the colostrum and milk to the lambs. It also goes horizontally from one sheep to another. And it shows up about 2 years later. It takes a while, but it slows down production. So I asked ChatGPT, if there's ever been cases of ovine progressive pneumonia in St. Croix sheep? And it says, yes, there's been cases. The overall infection rate is about 52% of the sheep, as well as Barbados blackbelly. So they tested positive. And this confirms they can become infected with OPP. But being infected is not the same thing as getting sick from a disease. So I asked another question. Have there ever been any cases of ovine progressive pneumonia in St. Croix sheep where the sheep actually died? If so, what was the death rate? And the answer was, well, there's no well-documented peer-reviewed report showing St. Croix sheep dying from ovine progressive pneumonia with a measured death rate for that breed specifically. Most studies only report infection, that they were positively infected rather than the clinical disease. So ChatGPT summed it up and said, yes, they can become infected with OPP. There's no mortality rate. General sheep data shows like 3 to 8% mortality rate. So there's evidence of infection, but it does not document the deaths or a breed-specific death rate for St. Croix sheep. So I asked the search assistant the same thing about the Mouflon, and it said they're not typically known to be affected by ovine progressive pneumonia, which really just affects domestic sheep. However, they're susceptible to diseases, but they're not known to be affected. So I started to notice that in the list of genetic tests for all the different diseases, they really didn't affect the St. Croix. Apparently because the St. Croix has not been inbred, having been taken from the island of St. Croix in 1975, and really wasn't very well known until maybe like 2010. So you got maybe 15 years of people actually monkeying with the St. Croix genetics through selective breeding. And like the Mouflon hasn't been ruined by selective breeding either because it's wild. while these other Old English breeds are totally toast genetically because they've been selectively bred. So instead of asking which of these tests apply to the St. Croix, I started asking, well, which sheep breeds have the most problems with this, like this spider lamb? So ChatGPT and artificial intelligence told me that spider lamb really only affects the black-faced sheep, mainly the Suffolk and the Hampshire. So what about Batten's disease, another incurable disease with an accumulation of lipopigments in the body's tissue, a very rare disease? Who does that affect? It affects the Suffolk and the Cheviot breeds. What about this Calipig mutation that makes a really large muscular rump, but it's not tender and doesn't have a lot of fat? Who does that affect? It's the Dorset and Hampshire sheep breeds. Here is chondrodysplasia, which is dwarfism, but it's also linked to that spider lamb problem. And who does it affect? The Suffolk and Hampshire sheep breeds. Another test they do is called dermospiraxis, White Dorper, Merino, Border Leicester, and Southdown breeds. Another genetic test offered by Flock 54 is Epeiromylosis junctionalis, an inherited skin disease. And who does it affect? The Spanish Chura and Mouton Vendine sheep. There's also a test for fecundity that's actually in the genetic code, and this could really help. Now, all I want are twins. I have problems with triplets and quadruplets. I've only seen a few triplets, and twins are plenty for me. But for somebody that wants to improve that, this is a great place to look. Here is Goucher disease, another genetic disease, and who does it affect? The Southdown and Baby Doll sheep breeds. This glycogen storage disease affects the Merino sheep breeds. This GM1 ganglioside problem affects the Romney Marsh breed. Hypotrichosis, or the hairless gene, affects the White Suffolk, Poll Dorset, and Merino. This brain malformation affects just the Spanish Chura and Dorset Cross. The test for the floppy lamb syndrome is for Romney lambs. The myotonia test is for mytonic goats, not sheep. Flock 54 has a genetic test for neuronal ceroid lipofuscinosis, and that's good for the South Hampshire, Rambouillet, Swedish Lambrace, and Merino. And the PCT test is primarily for the Scottish Blackface, as is the Ricketts test for the Scottish Blackface. Now, just because your sheep breed doesn't show up on this list doesn't mean it's not being affected, but we've never seen these kind of genetic disorders with the St. Croix sheep, just like they're not found with the Mouflon or any of the other sheep. And one of the ways to improve the genetics of your flock is to not deworm them, not use medications, and not try and save the sick, but cull the sick. So if you've got one that's got a problem, one of these genetic problems, it needs to be culled. Now you can go ahead and test and see if it's really a bad problem in your flock. But your best bet is just to cull all the ones that need to be culled. Natural culling is what nature does, and it works very well. You cull the sick ones out. The other thing that nature does is it keeps an even number of males and females and lets the best males breed, and the ones that aren't so motivated or not as strong, they don't breed. So you do have more females bred by a single male, but it's not like one male for 50 or 60 or 100 females, which is absolutely insane. Inbreeding, I believe, is the greatest crime against the genetics of our domesticated animals that could be made. And I'd like to encourage everyone, because, when you have a single male that breeds 100 different sheep, all the offsprings are half siblings. And when these half siblings breed, they have a 12.5% coefficient of inbreeding. And that's not good. So that's why you don't want to do it. You want to follow nature's pattern. You want to cull the sick off the bottom, the worst ones, just like a predator would, and let the rest of them breed openly and freely. Well, thanks for listening to the video today. Thanks.